Hi, this is lesson 6.7, part 2. Part 2 is called the labor unions of the Second Industrial Revolution. And finally, that loaded. So let's get right to it. In part 1, we talked about the real wages and how the wealth gap was growing. So, what begins to happen? Labor and management begin to battle over wages and working conditions. Workers begin to organize into the very first labor unions during this time. Some of these labor unions, such as under letter C, the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, it is still around today. In order to try to close the wage gap, workers decided that there is strength in numbers. Letter A, solidarity and collective bargaining. Solidarity means a labor union acts for all of its members. They join together. So one person going in to talk to the bosses, to talk to management, it does not have the weight as one person who is speaking for 300 people or 400 people. So they begin to see the benefit of sticking together, solidarity, and they begin to form labor unions. And labor unions rely on what is called collective bargaining techniques. Workers nominate leaders to go in and negotiate and talk and sit down face to face at the table with their bosses, with management, using their strength of numbers as an advantage. And most of the time this works. You sit down and you hash out the details of your working conditions. It's called a contract. But sometimes that doesn't work and you have to resort to other techniques or other tactics. Letter B, Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor was the very first organized labor union. Couple of things you need to know about it. It was made up of both skilled and unskilled workers. Skilled means you had to spend years learning a specific trade, whether you are a carpenter or a bricklayer. Unskilled simply means you need minimal training. So Knights of Labor included skilled and unskilled. Knights of Labor also allowed women as well as men. Knights of Labor also allowed whites and blacks, which was very unique for the time period. So Knights of Labor was the very first one. They wanted to pressure state governments and the national government to pass laws that were going to create an 8-hour workday. That was huge at the time. Workdays were 14, 15 hours. A 12 or a 10-hour workday was like, woo, yeah, we got a short day. So along with the 8-hour workday, the Knights of Labor wanted to abolish child labor, and the Knights of Labor wanted to increase taxes on the very wealthy, which would again give more money for the workers. Some of those ideas did not come to light until many, many years later, and some of which they're still struggling for today. After there was a series of violent events that were associated with the Knights of Labor, the Knights of Labor began to lose their credibility. There was a group of anarchists who set off a bomb at a Knights of Labor rally, which was held in the city of Chicago. And whenever there's bombings and anarchists, it tends to make the labor union look bad. So the Knights of Labor don't last the test of time. The Knights of Labor soon become associated with radicals and they lose favor and popularity. The second labor union, letter C, the one that is still around to this day, is the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. They only allowed skilled white male workers. You would belong to a trade union. For example, teachers are part of the American Federation of Teachers, which is part of the American Federation of Labor. You have to be a teacher. There are plumbers unions and bricklayers unions. They are very specific to your skill. They did not allow women, the AFL, because they felt that women were a distraction in the workplace. They also did not allow unskilled laborers. They did not allow black laborers, and they certainly did not allow Asian laborers because they work at cheaper rates, which would undermine. The AFL is all about taking care of their people and only their people. Their leader, Samuel Gompers, wanted to focus on what he calls bread and butter issues. What is going to impact the worker? Hours, wages, safety conditions, number of days worked in a week. So very specific ideas and very specific demands. He felt that you had to keep it located and you had to keep the focus on these bread and butter issues. So, what begins to happen? There are different tactics that labor unions use, and there are different tactics that the owners, aka management, use. The most common way that workers could try to force the hand of the owner is to do what is called a strike. A strike is a work stoppage where everybody who is working in the factory stops working. That's huge because when you stop working, the owner loses money because there's no more manufacturing. And then the owner is going to lose money. Thus, it might be easier just to give in to the labor union's demands from the first step. Also, labor unions can boycott products. If there is an issue with another company or another manufacturer, anybody that belongs to a labor union is supposed to boycott that business. For example, today, Walmart is a huge national, multinational, international corporation. They don't allow labor unions. So if you are in a labor union, you are supposed to boycott going to Walmart, thus harming them, and they wouldn't make as much money otherwise. But what happens? When strikes occur, sometimes the government doesn't look too favorably on labor unions. The federal government and the state government frequently sided with management. There was one instance where the Great Railroad Strike, where they shut down all of the railroads. Well, the mail traveled on the railroads, which again, you can't interfere with the mail. So the federal government had to send in armed troops to force the labor union workers to go back to work. And think about the railroad shutting down. That would be a crippling effect on the economy. So government response, they typically sided with management. They typically sided, with the wealthy elite. Letter B, lockouts. What would happen? Owners would try to sometimes lock out the workers. They would say, you're not allowed in. We're going to hire a non-union worker called a scab to cross the picket lines and work for less. Thus, knowing that if you don't have a job and you're a union worker and you're on strike or you're locked out, you don't get paid. So scabs were sent to break up the strikes. They would work for much lower wages. Sometimes they would even hire strike breakers. They would be kind of thugs who would come in and use violence to stop a strike. They would use violence. Sometimes they might even kill some of the union leaders. So as you can see, this is a very tumultuous time period where labor unions and management were still trying to figure out what is going on. So make sure you are able to explain what tactics labor unions used, as well as what the two labor unions were. That concludes part 2 of lesson 6.6.